Good evening. I'm Courtney Graham with Engagement Programs at the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to today's virtual conversation with legendary Chicago sculptor Richard Hunt on the occasion of his exhibition, Scholars Rock, or Stone of Hope, or Love of Bronze. First, I'd like to thank the Mickey Silverstein Endowed Fund for supporting today's program. We're so glad to have you joining us virtually. We hope that this digital format can offer a chance to stay connected to the Art Institute from home. This program is being recorded, so if you'd like to revisit it in the future, you'll be welcome to do so. We'll begin with a brief review of some of the features we'll be using today. This program will be shared in presentation mode, so we have turned off video and microphones for attendees. For optimal viewing, please select full screen mode under View Options in the top right corner of your screen. Throughout the presentation, you're invited to share questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We look forward to answering some of those at the end of the presentation. Closed captions are available and can be turned on via the controls at the bottom of the screen as well. If you encounter any technical difficulties during today's program, again, please let us know in the Q&A and we'll do our best to assist you. Now I'm honored to introduce our distinguished speaker. Raised in Chicago, Richard Hunt graduated from the School of the Art Institute in 1957, and in 1958, his work, Hero Construction, was acquired by the Art Institute. While still a student at SEIC, he began exhibiting his sculpture nationwide, and his work, Arachne, was purchased by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 1967, Hunt's career in sculpture began to take him outside of the studio with his first large-scale public sculpture commission entitled Play. This piece marked the beginning of a new chapter in Hunt's career, one that gave him the opportunity to work on sculpture that responded to the specifics of architectural or other designed spaces and the dynamics of diverse communities and interests. Since that time, he has created over 150 commissioned works. Many of these works are in the Chicago area, including Jacob's Ladder at the Carter G. Woodson Library, Free Form on the exterior facade of the State of Illinois Center, Flight Forms at Midway Airport, We Will at the Heritage at Randolph and Garland Court, and most recently, Light of Truth, a monument to Ida B. Wells in Bronzeville. Hunt has received accolades and recognition throughout his career and was the first African-American sculptor to have a major solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. His work can be found in numerous museums, as well as both public and private collections, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Gallery and National Museum of American Art in Washington, D.C., the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 1968, he was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson as one of the first artists to serve on the National Council on the Arts, the governing board of the National Endowment for the Arts. He has received many fellowships, prizes, and awards, and holds 15 honorary degrees from universities all over the country. In 2009, Hunt was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the International Sculpture Center. Richard will also be the recipient of the upcoming Legends and Legacies Award presented by the Art Institute's Leadership Advisory Committee. We look forward to honoring Richard next June at this celebratory event. Joining Richard in conversation is Ann Goldstein, Deputy Director and Chair and Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, and Jordan Carter, Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Art Institute. Thank you all so much for being with us. And now I will turn things over to Ann.
Thanks, Courtney. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome everybody joining us virtually. Jordan and I are thrilled to engage in this conversation with Richard, and on the occasion of his extraordinary exhibition that is currently on view at the Art Institute until September 20th. We hope very much that you'll have an opportunity to see it if you haven't, and if you have, to come back again before it's closed. And I wanted to now just turn it over to Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. And yes, indeed, it's an amazing privilege to be here with Richard. And although he needs no introduction and Courtney gave such a marvelous one, I thought I'd give a brief one of my own. One of the most illustrious graduates of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Richard Hunt is a Chicago legend and one of the most important sculptors of our time. In a career spanning more than 6 decades, Hunt has consistently and dynamically engaged the possibilities of metal sculpture in relationship to space, the body, and the built environment. He engages sculpture as a form of improvisation, an unfolding dialogue as the artist expresses between me, the technique, and the material. As we can see in the next slide, developed intuitively, his works emerge from a shape visualized in his mind, cut into metal and welded together in a process that can continue for many years. Inspired by the medium itself, he often reuses scraps and found metal and responds to the needs of the material in what he refers to as a, quote, ongoing process of things getting built and grown. It has been our honor and deep privilege to celebrate an artist who, as you will see in the next slides, was in many ways shaped at and by the Art Institute, as a student, as an artist, and as a patron. And I want to turn it over to Richard because you cite, Richard, the groundbreaking exhibition, Sculpture of the 20th Century, organized by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1952, and which traveled to the Art Institute in 1953, as a critical influence on your development. In particular, Le Montserrat by Julio Gonzalez, which we can see here on the right of the screen. I was hoping you could speak to us a little bit about this encounter with the exhibition at the Art Institute and its lasting impressions and how it sort of prompted you to begin working in metal.
Well, well, thank you for the opportunity. Looking at this picture of Julio Gonzalez with the picture of the Montserrat by Julio Gonzalez takes me back to the period of time when that exhibition came from the Museum of Modern Art to the Art Institute. And I had been like most people who decided they were going to be sculptors to work at the time in clay, plaster, working figuratively for the most part, but seeing that exhibition, and I can say in particular, this work of Gonzalez, which was figurative and expressive in a very important way, led me to think more about the possibilities of working in metal. And also at that particular time too, and in that exhibition, were a number of works by a developing group of British sculptors, Reg Butler and some others who were working directly in metal. I guess I was in my 3rd or 4th year at the Art Institute. But anyway, I thought, oh, there's a metal craft class. So yeah, I took that along with my sculpture, which was, like I say, was mostly modeling in clay and plaster, but it gave me a beginning, the metal craft class, of thinking about how to work in metal. And I started out by soldering small metal figures and all, but in my mind was the idea, gee, I'd like to make something that well, follows on what the work of Gonzalez represented. There are also at least one smaller constructed sculpture of Gonzalez in that exhibition. And like I say, there was this group of British sculptors who had already begun to work with metal, and I saw their work, and it just led me in that direction.
That's so fantastic. And I know you started in small scale, and we'll see some of those soldered wire pieces, which are actually on view in the exhibition or in our collection galleries a little bit later in the conversation. But if we go to the next slide, it wasn't too long after seeing that exhibition in 53, just not even 20 years later, in 1971, that your own solo exhibition would travel from the Museum of Modern Art to the Art Institute. And I'd just be curious to hear, about the impact of that exhibition, a little bit about how it came together and, what it meant for you at that time, and, just what sort of happened in those interim years that led up to such a momentous occasion.
Yes, well, so in those years, I went from, like I say, soldering, these smaller wire figures to then, getting a oxyacetylene welding torch, cutting torches, and all that, and one of the things that was a lucky thing for me is that I was living, at home. My parents lived in the Englewood area. Well, we lived in the Englewood area, and so I was able to set up a studio in the basement of our house, where I, with my oxyacetylene torch, started making some of the pieces that are in the slides that you see here. And just a moment ago, there was a slide of me in a junkyard, and one of the things too is that period, 50s, 60s, was the age of the chromed bumper in automobiles, and a lot of the elements, well, in that earlier picture there, I was sort of moving around through one of these scrap yards that had these chrome bumpers, and one of the things about it at the time, people were driving around their cars and maybe they get hit on the right or on the left, and bumper got dented. One could get a new bumper. More often, it led to a whole other kind of process. There were a lot of people then, supplying automobile parts, who would get these bumpers. They'd generally be, cars would have a bump on the right or the left. They would cut the bumper in half, and you get enough of those cut in half, and some parts will be on the right, some on the left. And so you see me in this picture going through and getting the bumpers that were smashed on whatever side they were smashed on, which were then the things I took to the studio, cut into with my oxyacetylene torch, and developed them in a way that I could make the sculptures that you just saw in that exhibition.
And I think, Richard, I think we have a prime example of one of these pieces incorporating bumpers and various automobile parts currently installed on our grand staircase here at the Art Institute. And that was really how it all began. And I'll turn it over to Anne to speak a little bit about how that work sort of got the pride of place it deserves.
Oh, thanks so much. This was a journey that started about 4 years ago. One day I was walking up the grand staircase, and if we go to the next slide, you'll see on the left the work by Mayol, which had been there for decades, and I felt that there could be an opportunity for us to have a change there and a different handshake to the Art Institute. And so I had, with the support of James Rondeau, he said, what would you put there? And I went to the collection, and it was almost immediately that I turned to Richard's Hero Construction, which, as we know, was made in 1958 and acquired by the museum that year. It just is a work that, and then I reached out to Richard and asked him if he was comfortable with us citing it there. I was still fairly new, having been at the museum for about a year, and Jordan had just started. And we invited Richard over to look at the space, and he worked with us very thoughtfully to cite it, every little detail of the pedestal and so on. You can also see that when we first installed it, Daniel Buren's sculpture for the stairs, up and down, in and out, step by step, was also installed. So you could see how we shifted from the Mayol to the work of Richard. And as Jordan said, this is a work that's made with automobile parts, I think mufflers in particular. And I just wanted to turn it to Richard, if you could say a few words, because also you had an amazing story about your experience of the Mayol and history, a little history there as well, with the connection of one of your teachers.
Yes, well, it just so happened that my teacher, my first sculpture teacher was a woman named Nellie Barr, and she and her husband, Paul Wiegard, who was chairman of the painting department during the time I was at the Art Institute. But anyway, they had been at the Bauhaus, and then where he had studied with Paul Klee and one thing or other. And anyway, they'd gone to Paris, and she had worked in my old studio, Nellie Barr had. And so, and of course, it was interesting to me, to think about, the fact that, my teacher had been in my old class, in his studio rather, and that, there I was kind of replacing the Mayol. And I'm sorry, my sculpture teacher, Nellie Barr, not around to see this. She'd be delighted. But anyway, it was an interesting, just aside that she had, been working for Mayol in his studio during the time they were in Paris, before, during the Second World War, the Germans came in there. She was, her husband was German, but was not Jewish, but she was Jewish. But anyway, they fled and ended up in Chicago. And of course, then, like I say, he was the chairman of the painting department at the School of the Art Institute, and Nellie was in the sculpture department.
Thanks, Richard. It's amazing. And also, just for all of us who work in museums, to remind ourselves of how artists use museums, and how I know this collection so deeply, and just having followed the programs of this museum for years, it's truly an honor and so important for us. I want to just go to the next slide, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Jordan. But as we can see here, this is a much more recent shot of Hero Construction. And I just, again, want to say, it really owns that space, and it is so beautifully the first work of art that people see when they walk into the museum from the Michigan Avenue entrance, and we couldn't be more honored. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jordan.
Yes, so after Hero Construction sort of made its return to the Art Institute on view here, where it shall remain, we continued the conversation, and it was an opportunity to begin thinking about how we might collaborate further. And in the next slide, we can see that there's, a wealth of riches and sort of inside of Richard's studio. And, it led to sort of numerous studio visits and numerous discoveries and dialogues that sort of led to the invitation to have Richard have an exhibition on our Bloom Family Terrace. But, you know, seeing these images of the studio, I think it would be so amazing for you, Richard, to give the audience a little bit of context about how you came to occupy this former electrical substation, I believe built in 1909. And you've been occupying it since around 1970, 71, around the time of your solo exhibition at the Art Institute. So I'd just be curious to hear about, you know, how you came to occupy this marvelous and epic space and what impact it's had on your practice and what it's allowed you to do that might not have otherwise been possible.
Well, it's interesting, small world stuff. And one thing I'd like to say with regard to, you know, my sculpture that was purchased, you know, the sculpture that was purchased that's on the landing, that was, you know, Catherine Koo was the curator of modern art at the time. And she prevailed upon one of the board members, a person very much involved with collecting art on his own and giving to the Art Institute. And that was a guy named Arnold Marymont, who, among other things, owned a muffler company. And so it wasn't very hard for Catherine Koo to say, well, you know, there's a sculpture I'd like to get, you know, it's made out of mufflers and such thing. And so the Marymonts purchased the sculpture as a gift to the Art Institute. Okay, then there's another person very much involved with the Art Institute, who was a lawyer, real estate developer, etc. Ruttenberg, and of course there's a Ruttenberg gallery downstairs, so like I say, he was a lawyer but also a real estate developer, and he had found some buildings in my general area, you know, where he either rehabbed the buildings or developed new buildings along with a partner of his, a guy named Sapera. But anyway, this building was sold in a surplus property by the Chicago Transit Authority. They built a new one underneath the elevated tracks just around the corner from me, and built a new electrical substation just underneath the railroad tracks. It tucks in there. It's about the size of a 5-car garage, which shows the difference between how one can convert electricity in, you know, 2050 or something. So anyway, from the old days, then from, you know, in 1909. So anyway, David Ruttenberg said to me, well, you know, we've got this building, but we don't want to tear it down and build some townhouses or apartment building. I think it would make a great studio. And he took me to see it. And I said, gee, indeed it would, you know. Anyway, we made a deal. And so here it is, instead of having these generators to turn the AC into DC, there's all this stuff of mine scattered all over. And again, another serendipitous thing was that these rails, like you can see in this picture along the window wall, where a crane can go north and south and move east and west, so that, you know, these larger things can be moved with the help of this crane. So I mean, it turned out to be just a great stroke of luck for me that, you know, I knew somebody who wanted to sell me this building, and here I am all these years later with it full of metal. And by the way, there's this piece kind of in the center of this image on the floor that was work on the Scholars Rock in progress when this picture was taken.
Exactly, and that's a really great segue, because in the next slide, I was hoping to maybe talk a little bit about Scholars Rock in particular.
Okay.
It's the work that gives the exhibition its title. We really sort of centered on this work as it was in progress during our conversations and studio visits. And in many ways, it's so emblematic of your practice, the way in which you took the scrap bronze, gave it a new life. And it's something that you've worked on for years, since about 2014, I believe.
Right.
And I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about, its title. I think it's one of your longest, and what it sort of means and sort of your process in making this piece.
Well, yeah, it is the longest title, and it's a piece I've probably worked on longer than any other piece. And the title incorporates several things that kind of came to mind as I began working on it. I get metal from these metal sources, companies who either roll the metal or stock metal of one kind or another. I got to know some people at these metalworking sales places, and they said, well, what do you do with this bronze and stuff like that? Oh, I make sculpture out of it. Anyway, and then I over time I sent the guy who you ordered metal from, some pictures of things, and then he saw the shapes of some of these metals and said, well, instead of just, I buy mostly sheets of metal, but it turns out that some of the forms of the metal in Scholars Rock came to me sort of pre-formed, because in the rolling process, something happened with the rolling, and the metal got sort of pushed up, and so there are these shapes that are sort of fluid, I'd call them, but which would have been, melted back down and rolled into flat sheet. But anyway, having this opportunity to have purchased these somewhat crumpled pieces, I had the opportunity to develop them into this sculpture. Not long before I started working on this sculpture, I'd been to China and saw some of these Scholars Rocks, the Scholars Rocks that they place in gardens, whatnot. Well, not that the sculpture is like a Scholars Rock exactly, but it gave me some ideas about shaping, forming some of the metal. And then I had the opportunity of having this metal that was deformed in a way that reminded me of the parts of the Scholars Rock. And then the Stone of Hope, that it came from a speech of Martin Luther King, Stone of Hope, and then of course the love of bronze. That's just me loving to work with bronze. So
That's beautiful. And indeed, you do love it because you've been working on this piece for a very long time. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Anne to sort of talk a little bit more about, how we got this piece, from the studio into onto the terrace, rather.
Great. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. And yeah, as you can see, Richard working on the piece. You can see him on the right, and he was working on the work, I think, literally probably as it was going out the door. And it's also my understanding, Richard, that you feel like you still need to do a little bit more work after the exhibition, and it's going to come back to the studio. So that's
yeah. I just sort of top it off, you might say. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. We can go to the next slide. So we want to take people to the museum, and there you can actually see this stunning moment of the arrival of Scholars Rock and Stone of Hope and Love of Bronze to the Bloom Family Terrace, and as a kind of capstone of 8 sculptures that are installed in that space. We can go to the next. And it was an amazing experience to envision the installation of these works, particularly during a pandemic when we were all working remotely. We worked through SketchUp. We did a lot of preparations in advance, but we also had the opportunity to make little adjustments on the site. You can see as it's being laid down, it's actually on dollies, and so we could rotate it around. And as heavy and formidable as these sculptures are, we were able to kind of play with them and finesse them precisely into their spaces. We can go to the next slide. And I would say that the joy of this for us was that Richard was there for every moment and involved in every selection. Not all artists are, is involved in installation, and Richard was on there, was up there with us at every point. So we can see the installation proceeding in the next slide. And this beautiful vista was really what we were imagining when we were doing all of this through, kind of virtual installation and SketchUp. This kind of 2-part installation with the platform in the foreground. And this is where the camera is positioned, is really where we kind of envision the kind of sweet spot of viewing. And so we see this kind of preliminary low platform with 5 sculptures on it as a kind of landscape, and then proceed beyond that. And you can go to the next slide, to the 3 large-scale sculptures. We all were so excited to look and to see the works, as much as you can envision them. You never ever can really see it until you're actually on the spot. And we always envisioned the skyline, but I think what was unexpected, especially with the stainless steel sculptures, was the incredible dialogue with Frank Gehry's Pritzker Pavilion in Millennium Park. So yeah, it was just a beautiful process that was so complex and seemed and just had a kind of lightness, and everything found its place. So I'm going to turn it back to Jordan.
Yeah, and from this image, I just want to focus in a second on the piece on the left called Planar and Tubular. Indeed, it does sort of bring together, the curvilinear and also the hard edge. But it was another work that we noticed that Richard was really working on over an extended period of time. And it sort of transformed over the course of our collaboration up until even on the terrace. So on the next slide, and then the next, we can sort of see on the left how, in the studio, we kind of thought the piece was already gorgeous and finished, but then we saw over time how it developed this wing of sorts. And then, as he said before, he sort of topped off the top of it with a whole new sort of spiraling construction. And on the next slide, We can see that Richard was simply not done there. He was ascending ladders on the terrace and very performatively almost bringing a finish to this piece, polishing it and so on. And I just thought maybe, Richard, you could say a few words about the process of this work and how this process unfolded.
Well, yes. I was glad to have the opportunity to exhibit it, and again, it had been a piece I'd started on and taken time off to do other things. As a matter of fact, I spent more time than like on the Scholars Rock and well, on some other commission things, but then when you and Anne expressed interest in it, I said, well, I want to top it off with something. I wanted to like the one curving tubular thing that I'm doing a little sanding on, a little surface work. I wanted then something else to go beyond that, so that there's this sense of the word, sense of the piece, moving ever upward, from one stage to another. And so I like the fact that I was able to, put the topmost piece on in time to have it in the show. Yeah.
Just barely, but no, we would have given you all the time you needed. And it's
well,
thinking about that since going upward and ascending upward, I wanted to briefly talk about the next slide. We had this platform with sort of more human scaled bronzes. And if we just go to the next slide, I wanted to briefly talk about a piece Out and Further Out, which is a generous loan from the Joyner Giuffrida collection, because instead of going, up and up, this one goes out and out horizontally. And you've spoken about how you sort of go from the vertical to the horizontal and what that means for you. So I thought maybe we could talk about that a bit. And you can go to the next slide, Devin.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It got to be, well, I mean, at a certain point, yeah, I decided I wanted to, instead of having things go outward, and this is kind of the first piece, where I've employed that, horizontal extension kind of idea, and as a matter of fact, I'm working now on pieces that have gone in this direction as well. But this was the first one where I experimented with the extension, the horizontality, as opposed to the verticality.
And it's super beautiful. I think Anne and I like to call it your odalisque as our little. It has that affect to it. And so I just want to transition inside for a bit, inside of the museum. And so there's a bit of a story here. I'll be brief as I want to make sure we get to questions. But, most of our exhibitions on the terrace, usually, we were talking about having some smaller works and maquettes inside of the restaurant. But due to COVID, of course, the restaurant was closed, which actually, at first seemed like a compromised situation, but we definitely turned it into an opportunity and were able to give your work an expanded footprint and definitely exhibit some larger works as well that we might not have been able to do otherwise. And also keep that amazing backdrop of the city skyline in the Frank Gehry Pavilion. But here we can see on the left that we have a selection of your works from the late 1960s and early 70s. And on the right, a selection of maquettes for sculptures you've realized in Chicago and in the vicinity. And so I just want to go to the next slide to give people, another sense of that space. And then on the next slide, maybe focus in for a second on wing ring hybrid, just to maybe talk about, this notion of hybridity in your work. And this is a titling construction that you use a lot, this idea of the hybrid. So I was curious if you could talk a bit about that, and maybe we can go to the next slide, which actually has this hybrid and then some of your larger hybrids as exhibited in your exhibition here in 1971.
Well, yes. So yeah, the idea of the hybrid, bringing things together to create, something that has, well, I would say more than one meaning, more than one interpretation. Well, as with plant material or whatever, the idea, that you use seeds from one thing and another, and grow something that has characteristics that might contain both, or so anyway, I went through, I guess, what you might call a hybrid period in terms of titling things, and of course, these works are all, from that period, like maybe a 10-year period. Some cast in aluminum as the ring hybrid, and others in bronze, and it was actually after developing the welded metal techniques that I had, I then spent some time in this case making things out of clay and sometimes out of wax, so they could be directly cast, or the ones in clay, which would have molds made from them, and then wax poured into them, and the casting process taken over.
They're such beautiful works, and I love how they bridge the organic and the industrial and really have this sense of biomorphic abstraction. It really speaks to the time, but yet they're so enduringly contemporary in terms of, post-minimal work at the time, and also just how fresh and amazing they are being discovered in your studio and brought into the gallery space. Just simply fantastic. In the next slide, I wanted to focus on this particular maquette, which we have on view, because the piece that it represents in smaller scale here was actually just recently realized, and it's the Light of Truth, Ida B. Wells National Monument in Bronzeville. And I'm just hoping that, Richard, you could talk a bit about what it meant to engage the figure Ida B. Wells to make a national monument for this amazing civil rights icon, and how you came to this sort of shape and this form, and it's just so impressive and magnificent. I think we'd all love to hear you speak a bit more about it.
Well, I'm happy to speak about it. It was a work that was a long time in coming. I was asked by, Ida B. Wells Commemorative Committee to, if I would think about doing a piece, and as a matter of fact, I'd come up with several ideas over a period of time. Now there was, well, the extended period of time had to do with several things. Well, them being able to raise the money for it, and the way there was this public housing in this area called the Ida B. Wells homes, and those were torn down. Well, this goes back now 14 years. So when the public housing was torn down, and the whole area redeveloped, some as parkland, some sold, and other kind of housing from sort of single family homes to apartment buildings. And her house is now a landmark. It's on the west side of Martin Luther King Drive. But anyway, this piece, which is in the park that goes north and south through, what would have been that property, well, gave me the opportunity to place this thing in the center of this park. And interestingly, one of Ida B. Wells' grandsons was a structural engineer who worked for Skid Moorings and Merrill. And he was one of the people who helped me, develop ways of placing pieces, in some of the work I did. Actually, the first being of this piece called Play, which is out at this Illinois State hospital, and he was, like I say, a structural engineer at Skid Moorings and Merrill, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, then and it's unfortunate that both he and his brother, who was a community activist, they didn't live to see this, but the great granddaughter, the son of the guy who was the activist, was there, and her two brothers. But anyway, it was something that was finally realized, and a piece that has, okay, so it is what it is as a sculpture, and then on the three stanchions that hold up the sculptural form, there are engraved panels with pictures of her at an early and a later age, and some of her quotations. And it's turned out, I think, to be a good, it works well in the space, and so far it's attracted a fair amount of attention and interest, not only from people in the community, but elsewhere.
Well, it's simply magnificent. It was an honor to be at the unveiling, and I encourage everyone on the call, if you have not seen it, to get down to Bronzeville and see this truly epic sculpture and this monument to Ida B. Wells. It's just simply breathtaking.
So it's about 30 feet tall.
It's magnificent. And I guess with that, I want to take us, or pass it over to Anne to take us way back in time, back to when you were a student, and to our collection galleries, on our modern collection galleries on the third floor of the modern wing, to talk about those soldered wire pieces that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk.
Thanks, Jordan. And yeah, indeed, everybody should really take the opportunity to see the Ida B. Wells monument. It's such an extraordinary sculpture. I just wanted to quickly point out the third section of our exhibition before we turn it over, hopefully, to some questions. But as Jordan said, we kind of make a full circle here to the beginning of Richard's career when we go to the third floor of the modern wing in our modern galleries. And we had the delight and the kind of warm welcome of our curator of modern contemporary art, Caitlin Haskell, to collaborate on locating three sculptures by Richard from this period of the early to mid 1950s, when he was still a student and working in his parents' basement making these soldered wire sculptures. And you can see they've lived in two places during the course of the exhibition. On the left, you can see they were in a space with works by Giacometti, Picasso, and Dubuffet. And in the next slide, you can see where they currently are, and you can visit them. In a space with Richard Pousette-Dart, Norman Lewis, and Jackson Pollock. And so we are thrilled to have them, and amazingly, it came to our knowledge that on the third floor of the modern wing, this is the first time the work of a living artist has been included in those galleries. So it enlivens the space and creates beautiful and dynamic dialogues between the works, and we're just so thrilled to live with them. So that, I think, concludes our presentation. We just wanted to open it up to some questions and turn to this beautiful picture that's our favorite of Richard standing with his sculptures on the Bloom Family Terrace. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jordan, who's going to help us with the questions that have been submitted by all of you.
Yes, so I hope we can get through a couple of questions. There's so many amazing questions from a very engaged audience, Richard. So let's start.
Okay. Yeah.
One question we have here is, what was your earliest memory of art?
My earliest memory of art, that is to say, of seeing it, like going to the Art Institute or something like that.
I think interpretation, you know, your earliest experience or memory.
Well, I guess the two answers. I mean, well, the experience of art is that from the time I was a kid, I had, you know, crayons and paper and was making, you know, drawing and stuff. But then my parents, in particular, my mother, one of the things she did with my sister and I was going to the museum, the Art Institute, the Field Museum, the Planetarium, and all that. And I mean, I can't remember exactly how old I was when I first went there, but I was a kid, you know, yeah. And so there was this early introduction to art, and of course, not to mention the fact that you know, there's the Art Institute, but there's a lot of art in the Field Museum, like from Africa and one place and another. And of course, all of that was of interest.
That's amazing. And of course, yeah, there are those influences there. And we have another question here, which is really quite interesting in relationship to really seeing how the sculptures on the terrace have changed over time and the patina and how that's shifted and how you really sort of embrace that indeterminate sort of process of showing the work in different contexts over time. And the question is, how are the sculptures maintained over time to keep the chrome so smooth and shiny, even though they're outside for decades? And so I guess it's a question about duration and relationship to patina and conservation of the work.
Right. Well, you know, there are, with the different metals, the different possibilities. Okay. You know, I've done pieces in aluminum and stainless steel. Well, they tend to stay that way. You know, however, you know, if you sanding, polishing, they'll stay that way. The bronzes, you know, they tend to develop a patina, and if you want shiny bronze, that's something you have to maintain. Either you might coat it, you know, with something, or wax it, you know, time and again. But you know, bronze, while it'll last forever, given, you know, just being outside, will make it turn green, like the lions in front of the Art Institute. So you know, so it depends. I mean, like there are people who have pieces of mine in their gardens or whatever, or on the, you know, outside of public buildings, whatever. You know, it has something to do with you know, their sense of what they want it to look like, you know, and they maintain it, you know, or let it turn green, you know, yeah, like I say, depending on their feeling about what it should look like in whatever context they place it.
That's amazing. And I love your openness to, you know, the various ways that the metal can transform, and really working with the material and sort of the environment in that way. And that's kind of a good segue to another question, which is sort of about these two branches of your activity, the gallery sculptures and then the outdoor sculptures and commissions. And the question is, how does your work shift when they exist beyond an institutional space, say the Art Institute? How does that shift?
Wait, say it again. How does the work?
Your work shift, or your practice, or I guess your the way in which you sort of perceive the work, or how you sort of make the work, or how you
Right.
sort of differ between sort of a museum space and say an outdoor space or a commission?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, well, but for the most part, it has to do with the scale of things. I mean, things that are commissioned that'll be outdoors in a park or on the corner or something like that, and the pieces that whether they're in a museum or in somebody's home or in an office, the scale of them, basically determines, and of course there are pieces. I mean, it's large scale commission pieces. Have a different sort of path, you might say. Somebody expresses an interest in a piece, they'll go somewhere on a wall in a plaza or whatever, and I develop through scale sketches, scale models, some conference, maybe with the people who are commissioning it, is one thing. But then there are these works I do that are just self-initiated and developed, and I mean, some may end up, purchased by individuals, families, whatever, and others by museums. I mean, and so, and very seldom have there been times when a museum might want to commission a particular piece for a museum. I mean, that's happened sometimes, but more often they're pieces that either curators or people involved with the museum might say, oh, this piece ought to be here, it's in a gallery or whatever. So there are those two differences. Right?
Thank you for sort of speaking on your experiences with those different sort of platforms or modalities of engagement. I guess sort of to wrap things up, I think there's a question we'd all love to hear more about as we end the conversation, which is, Richard, what are you working on right now?
Well, I'm working on pieces to exhibit now. I mean, like I've been there's one piece there's one commission I'm working on, which I'll deliver in about a month, which is for a Lutheran financial services organization called Thrivent in Minneapolis, and it'll go out in front of a building that they just built last year, that went through that process of models and the one thing and another and all. But right now in the studio, I am working on pieces that I'll exhibit in a gallery maybe in the spring. I think it'll take me that long to get a few pieces together that I might put into an exhibition.
That's so fantastic. And I just want to thank you, Richard, and thank the audience so much for being here. And it's just, I can't say how much, it's just been a true honor to collaborate with you. And it's really been a true collaboration all the way through. And I just really am just so honored to be able to celebrate you. And I want to encourage everyone to please visit the exhibition in its final weeks, closing at the Art Institute on September 20th. Richard Hunt, Scholars Rock, Our Stone of Hope, Our Love of Bronze. And I'll pass it over to Anne for some closing remarks.
I just want to express my deepest gratitude also to you, Richard. It's just a joy to listen to you. I know there were many more questions that we could answer, and I'm sorry for that. Thank you, everybody, for submitting such thoughtful questions. And I know we could go on for a long time. So we hope to have opportunities to continue the discussions. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to just turn us back to Courtney to close us out.
Thank you so much. And a huge thank you to Richard Hunt for joining us this evening. And thank you, Anne and Jordan, for sharing this discussion with us. The exhibition, as Jordan mentioned, will be on view through September 20th. And for more information on upcoming virtual events, please visit us online at artic.edu and look for our monthly e-news in your inboxes. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone.